history underneath us all the time. If the Earth were 24 hours old, modern humans would exist for about 0.002 of a second. Everybody blink? Wow, with the delay on Zoom, I got to see myself blink. That was kind of weird. The delay on Zoom would be about the time that modern humans have existed. We know that rock goes back. The bedrock, the oldest rocks on the planet, go back between 6 and 4.5 billion years old. The rock that underlies Winnipeg at the deepest level is about 4.5 billion years old. Here in Winnipeg, especially, you can see some evidence of this if you go out to eastern Manitoba or northwest Ontario. The beautiful rolling granite hills are actually the roots of mountains that at one point were taller than what the Himalayas are now. Here, we're always sort of at the edge of those mountains, and it is a story of ice and water that's carved that down to what we have now. I'll show Winnipeg is right here on this map. We've got a thick layer of clay. That's ancient lake bed. We've got some glacial till. That's gravel. We've seen this in the last week. We've certainly seen it over the last couple months. Folks, you know when the snow melts, there's always gravel everywhere from the roads. Well, imagine a winter that lasted 10,000 years. The glaciers would push a lot of material, grind it off the rocks, and when it melted, you ended up with gravel or sand piles called glacial till. Underneath that, we have Stony Mountain limestone, Red River limestone, the Winnipeg Formation, and then below that, Precambrian rock, 4.5 billion years old. It's that there we go. The Stonewall Formation is just to the west and north of us. It's some of this Red River and Winnipeg limestone where we find Tyndall stone. A little bit more on that in a bit. But Manitoba marble is found east of Winnipeg. Anyway, some of that Precambrian rock. We have a beautiful example of it sitting just behind where the cafe is, just behind the reception center. The Buffalo Rubbing Stone would be called a glacial erratic. It's not the type of rock that you'd find on the surface of the prairies normally. Again, it's Precambrian shield. We saw that that's off to the east or deep below us. That rock was pushed out onto the prairies sometime probably between 10,000 and 16,000 years ago by the advancing Wisconsinian glacier ice sheet. The Wisconsinian glaciation is called that because it got as far south as the modern state of Wisconsin. That rock's a lot older than 16,000 years, though. During the Precambrian era, the time when the oldest rock on Earth was formed, you can see these mountains here in the what's now eastern Manitoba, northern Minnesota, northwest Ontario. That's the range that was higher than the Himalayas. We're right on the edge here. Anyway, that rock would have been in the root of one of those mountains. It's seen most of Earth's history. The Precambrian is when life first emerges on this planet. That rock is as old as life itself. In some indigenous traditions, rocks are sometimes referred to as grandfathers. I don't know about you, but my grandpa was full of stories. When I think about what he had collected over his 90 years of life and the number of stories he had compared to that rock's 4.5 billion years, just think of what that rock has seen. I think about what that rock has seen in the 20 years since the reception center was built. Never mind a blink of an eye. That's too fast for Zoom. You wouldn't even see it. But in the last 20 years, it's had many, many, many stories written around it. And that's just the surface. Now, skipping forward, Tyndall stone on that reception center, and we wouldn't necessarily have Tyndall stone underneath us, but we certainly have Ordovician limestone. There's no floodway big enough to deflect a warm inland sea. But about 450 billion years or million years before present, that is what we had in southern Manitoba. Now, where those mountains used to be, they've worn down quite a bit over 3.5 billion years, as rocks will do over billions of years. But they're still sticking up above the waterline enough that in a very warm period, their land, when what's now the rest of Manitoba, is warm ocean. Warm ocean, full of critters. Warm ocean, where the water flows over those rocks of land and dissolves minerals and drops them off. If you look closely underneath the dot and you listen carefully, you can almost hear the minerals knitting together and the little animals burrowing through it, rolling around in it, falling down and having their shells preserved, making Tyndallstone. This is the Tyndallstone on the back of the reception center. Marble is limestone that's been subjected to great pressure and heat inside the earth. Tyndallstone has never been that, so it's not truly marble, but that marbling pattern certainly is in there. And I've definitely heard this referred to as Manitoba marble. What's kind of cool, some of these animals, like our gastropod or our shrimp, we see modern animals or early forms of modern animals emerging in the ground that's underneath Fort Whyte in this era. We also have things like a nautiloid cephalopod or receptaculid. Those end sort of with that Ordovician era. They're not around anymore. So we sort of see a change between truly ancient and more life like we would expect it. That story is written in the rocks deep below us. That reception center stands at the edge of Lake Devonian. Devonian, our northernmost, or sorry, not our northernmost, that is Lake Cargill, our westernmost lake. The Devonian period was when much of the oil in Western Canada formed. Why did it form? Because, again, we were a warm, shallow tropical sea. Where Winnipeg is, in the Devonian, 360 million years ago, we had a climate very, very, very similar to what you might find in the Florida Keys or off of Cuba right now. Shallow seas, warm and tropical. If anybody had been around to go snorkeling, it would be amazing. Very much like the Caribbean, but again, pirates don't evolve for another 360 million years. Snorkelers for another 50 years after that. But yeah, beautiful, warm ocean, full of life. That life would fall, and as other sediments would fall on top of it, compress and compress and compress, and where there were reefs that bulged up, those reefs would form traps and force all sorts of liquid from rotted animals up and form domes that we now find as oil in Western Canada. Now, there's never been oil found at Fort Whyte. There's never been oil found in this part of Manitoba, but it was a family that set up a foundation, the Devonian Group, to help fund environmental reclamation because they realized that having made money in oil, they needed to give something back to the environment. All of Fort Whyte, well, all of the south part of Fort Whyte was at one point industrial land and has been reclaimed. So that's why we have that lake named that. They thought it would be a good place to support. We're going to skip way forward. Why? Because we have lots and lots and lots of really, really dry years. You think that this spring was dry? What's now southern Manitoba had essentially a drought that was 100 million years long. Now there was some swamp, but that swamp really didn't do much. It really just sort of washed away or dried right up and blew away or was washed away during the dry times. To get fossils, to understand what's going on deep in the earth now, on top of the earth at the time those rocks were formed, we needed active animals and deposition of new sediments. You need layers to that cake to catch things. Not a lot of rock forms here in Manitoba during most of what's called the Mesozoic, the middle life, the dinosaur era. So we don't have a lot of those in what I call the greater Fort Whyte area, what most folks would call southern Manitoba. During the Cretaceous, things change. You can read my terrible poetry. Mountains rise in west. Winkler, Warden, Altona are mosasaur nests. Dinosaurs rule Earth. They practice good, leave no trace here in Winnipeg. Southern Manitoba, during the Cretaceous, 65, 70 million years ago, was our delta. Rivers were flowing into a very, very shallow sea. That's why we find, well, if anybody's a fisher, you know that you catch the biggest pike, the biggest northern pike, the biggest jackfish hanging out where there's a drop off. Mosasaurs are giant aquatic reptiles. Um, Morden has the Canadian Fossil Discovery Centre. It's absolutely famous for Bruce the Mosasaur. They hung out where the drop off was, and that was around what's now the Pembina Valley. We may have had dinosaurs moving through the Winnipeg area, but because there was no fossils being made, we don't know. They didn't leave any record or trace. Further south and west, where it was more upland again, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, we actually have tyrannosaur fossils in the lake falling into the swamps that are sort of around the edges of that sea. Here in Manitoba, no such luck. We just get the giant aquatic reptiles. Skipping forward again many years, about 60, well, from 65 million years ago to 350,000 to 15,000 years ago. Things changed on Earth and we went into a really long, extended cold period. North America was colder than it ever had been before. Again, over here, if you can picture the map, that's the south end of Lake Michigan. We'll have Wisconsin over here. Well, Michigan would be sort of here, Wisconsin on this side, absolutely covered with ice. All of Manitoba is underneath an ice sheet. Most of Canada from coast to coast to coast is covered by that Laurentian ice sheet. The Ice Age, a glacier is about a kilometer thick. The glacier puts so much pressure on North America, the whole thing starts tilting underneath it. We're still actually popping up. Did you know that Churchill is actually rising a perceptible but tiny amount? Maybe I think it's less than a centimeter a year, but it's still coming back up. We call it isostatic rebound. You know, in basketball, a rebound is when it bounces, somebody else picks it up. The Earth is still picking itself up from having all that weight of ice on it that many thousands of years ago. When those sheets melted, the puddle and the resulting mess from the puddle, that's right, I'm calling southern Manitoba a puddly mess, but that's really what it would have looked like. Lake Agassiz was a 5,000 year long and giant puddle. At different times, this lake, ice to the north, ice to the west, very still kind of chilly, but as Earth warmed, the glacier melted and left behind the giant puddle. At different times, it did drain out what's now the Ottawa Valley, the Great Lakes, down the Mississippi. In fact, the Red River used to flow the other way, pick up to the Mississippi, and dump water to the Gulf of Mexico, sometimes even out the Mackenzie Valley, until eventually the ice melted and Lake Agassiz could melt to Hudson Bay, could send water north. The land was already tipped that direction, and as that lake went, it did leave lots of till, and on top of that till, clay. The sandy lands here out by Steinbach, the sandy lands and the Assiniboine Hills are in fact ancient beaches or ancient deltas where rivers flowed into the big lake and dumped lots of sand, or where the sand washed up on shore. Relevant to Fort Whyte, you know, there's that clay that sits on top of the gravel at the edge of the puddle as they dry up in the spring. If it's on your driveway, you sweep it off. If it's on the roadway and you're out for a bike ride, you dodge around it because you don't want to slip in it. Imagine what that would look like if that puddle was 5,000 years old from a 15,000 year long winter. That is what underlies Fort Whyte. Now, the first people on the land moved in after the lake drained, probably following herds of bison. There's much history. There's much to learn about that era. There's much to learn from different First Nations perspectives. This talk is not about that. I just wanted to acknowledge that. It is a voice that is missing from this talk, but there are other places where you can go to fill that in. This is more about how we became majestically flat. Following those bison onto this majestically flat landscape, a little bit later, were the Métis people who grow out of the fur trade. Now, that flat landscape was home to lots of different critters, but the bison was probably the most important. Bison are built for speed across the plains. They're built to eat grass in dry environments. They're built to survive the cold. Every person who came onto the prairies really had some interaction with the bison, whether it was directly or not. Bison are what sort of made settlement and life here possible. Now, one of the results of that glaciation and of that lake deposit was really good farmland. And we do have, after the Dominion Lands Act is passed in 1869, 1870, we do have folks moving in to settle down. The sod house, this is Fort Whyte sod house. The earth actually becomes a shelter for people. Not only does it support, it also now shelters. The really rich farmland is thousands of years of grassland, bison poop, prairie fires, tall grass prairie, growing, leaving thick, thick layers on top of the glacial soil, most places, for good farming. Although, according to Mr. Yule Hind, not so much in what's now southwest Winnipeg. Why? Because we're part of the floodplain. The Red River would tend to wash some of that good stuff away and leave us with that glacial Lake Agassiz clay. There wasn't a lot of action in terms of pioneer settlement in this area. You can't drink the water, you can't grow crops in the land very well, so why would you come? Until a rail line goes through here, more on that in a little bit, and in 1907, city of Winnipeg is growing. Believe it or not, Winnipeg was on pace to be larger than Chicago until not the ditch that protects our city, but another ditch was cut across Central America. The Panama Canal actually really changed rail transport, and all of a sudden there was less demand. That's why Winnipeg's not bigger than Chicago right now. I kind of like living in a mid-sized city, so maybe it wasn't the worst thing in the world. Anyway, Winnipeg is booming right around that turn of the last century. The automobile has just been introduced as a way to get around. The demand for concrete, cement to build roads and to build taller buildings is very much present. The Canada Cement Company starts work on the land that would become FortWhyte Alive in 1907. Why there? It's on a rail line. There's a rudimentary road network that lets you get to the growing city of Winnipeg, but you're not in the city, and clay and gravel, almost like the glaciers dumped that there on purpose, the clay and gravel are easily at hand. So those materials are dug out of the ground. You can sort of see the beginning of Muir Lake. You can sort of see the beginning of the lake immediately to the west. You can sort of see the first little bit of Fox Bay being formed in 1928. By 1950, this is what things looked like after, I believe, after the Red River flood. Our lakes, some of them have sort of taken their modern form. A little bit more digging goes on. Now, just wanted to point out that Winnipeg at this point is really, really, really growing, really booming, and all eyes are occasionally on Winnipeg. This is 1919. Some of you will remember the 100-year celebration of the Winnipeg General Strike in 2019. Just so you know, that actually affected the cement plant at FortWhyte Alive, or what wasn't FortWhyte Alive then. The Fort Whyte Cement Works also went on strike to join that big labor movement that brought in a lot of the things that we enjoy today. Anyhow, as the landscape grows, as more work goes on, as more is dug out of the ground and made into concrete, more lakes are formed until it's to a point where the resource is sort of starting to play out, and it's easier to bring in clay and gravel and limestone from other places. The factory is still in operation, but there's this wetland, sort of industrially scarred landscape left behind. A bunch of people actually get together who work at the cement factory after the 1950 flood. They call themselves the Lucky 13 Rod and Gun Club. And they have a vision for a place where the industrial landscape that their work, their employer, their own actual personal work has left behind could be turned back to nature and used to help people connect to the natural world. By and large, they'd grown up on farms or at the edges of the growing city, and they saw that their kids and their kids' friends and other folks in Winnipeg weren't having that connection to nature. Now, it was the 1950s, so they really didn't know what to do with that. I'm not sure that if you would have said environmental education back then, anybody would have even really known what you were talking about. I don't think they would have really anticipated quite what would become. They helped build the adventure site, they helped open up, they released some geese in the 50s to sort of renaturalize the lakes. Planting projects and regreening projects go on. What's kind of cool is that they start bringing in schools. They start bringing in guides and scouts to see what they're doing with the geese and with the land, things regreening. But pretty soon, it can't just be an amateur project anymore. It's beyond their capacity to maintain as volunteers. The adventure site was the first education building built at Fort Whyte, specifically for education and outdoor programming in 1974. On that first lake, very near where the first geese were released. By 1981, things are too big to handle, and they're looking at building the Fort Whyte Center for Environmental Education. And yeah, X marks the spot. That is, in 1981, what the footprint of what we now have as the Interpretive Center took place, or looked like. There's a little bit of a road in. You can still see some of the ponds. They've maybe changed shape a little bit. You can see what have become our marsh and our swamp. You can see some of our forest, but it's a very different looking place. The shapes of the lakes haven't changed, but just about everything else has, including now the interpretive center that would go where X marks the spot. Kind of exciting on this landscape that has been scarred and allowed to heal, on this land that was set in motion by those ancient seas, set in motion by those glaciers in Lake Agassiz. We're still seeing change. We're still seeing species return and things regreen. We're learning to be a little bit more conscious of what we do on the place too. Part of that is the new Interpretive Center. The new Interpretive Center is a cleaner, greener building, more energy efficient, more, well, built with materials to last a lot longer and lock up carbon a lot longer than some of what had been built in the early 80s. It was a little bit strange for me to call this slide now the first interpretive center, but there has been a major change there as well. The new interpretive center, I think it's appropriate because the land was shaped by ocean and then frozen water in the form of a glacier and then the lake. The new interpretive center kind of looks like it has the scales of a fish on it. To me, that reminds me of the watery origins of the whole landscape, not just the watery origins of Fort Whyte. By 95, Fort Whyte is growing. We're seeing more and more schools come. Fort Whyte is on path to see more visitors, exploring all sorts of environmental issues, seeing all sorts of conservation in action. The mid-90s were sort of the next major expansion. What about this land to the north? This farmland is starting to play out. This forest land has been used by the cement industry. This forest land has been used to cut firewood over the years by people who live in that growing city of Winnipeg. Is there more of a story? Is there more land that we can use to tell that environmental and conservation story? Land is acquired to push all the way up to, Wilkes Boulevard. It became Sterling Line a few years later. The Alloway Reception Center opens about 20 years ago. It's full of that beautiful limestone from the Red River Formation. Sorry, folks, I just pointed at my screen. I have to remember that I need to use the little pointer. Anyway, it opens up to welcome a whole new set of visitors, that enhanced visitorship that we have, and really celebrate acquiring the space to the north and helping it regreen. I've, as I said, worked at Fort Whyte since 2003. I've seen our bison prairie go from quite scraggly. Our buffaloes were never scraggly, but our prairie was. I've seen the tall grass prairie restoration grow. Bison Butte, I've seen it rise from scrap to being a beautiful green place that welcomes people for low impact recreation. I've seen our forests grow and become dedicated to bigger purposes. We really have gone from a clay pit to beautiful wildlife habitat enjoyed by our species, but also hundreds of others. Fort Whyte Farms comes along a little bit later. Fort Whyte Farms is the social enterprise wing of the organization, of course. Fort Whyte Farms is really taking us back to some of the early agricultural roots and finding out that you can actually grow things in the soil if you treat it right. If you use things like compost and work with the land instead of fight with the land, it will grow good things for you. And the youth that Fort Whyte Farms helps grow as well are another thing that just grows and improves and becomes better for their time in this space. Now, I said I've seen the forest grow and be differently dedicated. Giving Grove on the north part of our forest. Um, our North Forest has been used by different groups to cut firewood for a very long time. So it used to give heat and warmth, possibly shelter. I don't know that anybody really built a cabin out of the aspen trees that like to grow there. About 10 years ago, Giving Grove was dedicated to our volunteers, past, present, and future. Fort Whyte, as nonprofits go, is actually quite small in terms of its staff. Our volunteers are one of the great big backbones that allow us to do all the different things that we can do to really help the land tell its story. Question that I always get when I'm doing presentations for tourists: when do we get to see the fort? Always like to point out that no, it's not Lower Fort Garry. That is a fort, but it is not FortWhyte Alive. Also not FortWhyte Alive are our northern neighbors at Oakhammock Marsh. Beautiful place, definitely dedicated to waterfowl and conservation education. Super embarrassing for a bus driver when they show up there and they were coming to us. Super awkward when a bus shows up and they expected to be going to Oakhammock Marsh, but they arrived at Fort Whyte. We sort of will call the other place and try to work with them and see if we can do an itinerary that helps them do what they need to do. But neither of these are FortWhyte Alive. Fort Whyte, not run together as one word, but Fort Whyte was a fort that barely was for a battle that was never fought, but changed Winnipeg and Manitoba and Canadian history forever. In 1888, William Whyte was the Director of Operations for the Canadian Pacific Railway in Western Canada. Canadian Pacific Railway had a monopoly on all rail transport in the West. They got that by building the railway from Eastern Canada to BC. It ran east-west. If you know anything about the history, right from the first people through the fur trade through pretty much the modern day, most trade from this part of the world has gone north-south, not east-west. Winnipeggers wanted a railway that ran to St. Paul, Minnesota. To get from downtown Winnipeg to St. Paul, you have to cross the CPR tracks. To have one railway cross another railway is actually pretty difficult, and Whyte saw his opportunity to maintain his monopoly, keep the cash flowing to CPR and nobody else. Instead of going to the courts to enforce his monopoly as he could have, he let the upstart railway start building, and then he hired a bunch of, hired muscle. He found some of the roughest, toughest guys he could to stop the construction crew from building across his railway. The construction crew hired their own muscle, and things got pretty tense. There were fights breaking out near the tracks. Because it was pretty easy to, once everybody goes home for the night, we just start working. We put on our headlamps and we work in the dark. Whyte realized if he was really going to stop this upstart railway and maintain his monopoly, he needed his men out there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. He had some locomotives brought up from Toronto and arranged in the prairie to block the construction crew and serve as a home base for his tough guys. The press quickly dubbed this structure Fort Whyte to sort of make fun of him. What kind of guy is this that doesn't just use the normal channels to keep his business going? Anyway, the standoff at Fort Whyte lasted from summer 1888 into fall 1888. If you've ever stood out on the land at FortWhyte Alive and looked into the north as the first storm of November blows in. Now imagine camping out there. Now imagine camping out there with 1890s technology, not 2020s technology. You begin to see why things were really getting tense and everybody wanted this to end in the fall. It did. The fallout from raising two private armies to fight it out, duke it out in southwest Winnipeg was that CPR, the Canadian Pacific Railway, lost their monopoly in Western Canada, and that the upstart railway had to pay some reparations to the CPR for losing that monopoly. But both railways got built. That line that ran down to St. Paul, well, it was the second railway in Western Canada that wasn't Canadian Pacific Railway. If you know your rail history, we're one of the few countries with two national railway systems, the Canadian Pacific and the Canadian National. Canadian National was formed when all those little railways were put into one network. This Canadian National Railway has its foundation as those trains cross those tracks very near where FortWhyte Alive lies today. In fact, I've been told that it's just to the west of the land where we are now. And Fort Whyte is still growing in programming. Fort Whyte is still growing, literally growing greener every year as we reclaim some of that industrial brownfield, as our bison are allowed to add to the prairie soil and really enrich what had been fairly roughly treated clay farmland. Fort Whyte Alive is still growing in the hearts and minds of everybody who comes for an environmental education program or an outdoor recreation program. And it's an exciting place to be as such. It might have started off as ancient seafloor. We might have been set in motion towards being the organization and place we are today by the mud that settled to the bottom of a 5,000-year-old puddle. But am I ever happy that all those things sort of conspired and transpired to set us up to where we are today? I'm very, very happy to help people get connected to our majestically flat land, help understand both the human and the natural story of the place, and how that story can tie you to other cultures and other natural settings all around as well. So, thank you everybody for tuning in. If you do have any questions, you can put them in the chat and Connor will pass those along. I wish everybody a great Earth Day. I hope that this geological look at why Fort Whyte is where it is and how it is sort of makes you consider a little bit more about soil and rock and what we gain from that, and also what we need to do to protect those landscapes as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Barrett. We really appreciate it. It's one of my favorite presentations, and I'll open up to the chat now. If anyone has any questions, we'll give you a bit of time to get typing, and I can pass those on to Barrett. So we'll give you some time to enter your questions into the chat.
And as you enter your questions, I want to give a little shout out to a group of forest immersion kids who this is a group that meets every week at Fort Whyte Alive. They're school age. They got very intrigued by a concrete foundation they found at the edge of the woods 2 weeks ago. We couldn't do anything with it last week because it was underneath this much snow. This week they asked if they could start digging on it, and we did. We measured things out, we took pictures. We're actually currently researching a brick that is probably from that industrial era, probably at least 100 years old, if not 100 to 115 years old. So again, we're constantly working to understand more about all eras of human activity and how we've always connected to this place. So anyway, a great big shout out to them and their hands-on history. And the last 48 hours have got me more excited about bricks in Manitoba than I ever thought possible.
As we wait, Barrett, I'm going to start off with a question just to get things rolling. One that I asked the previous presenter, and I think it's a perfect one to ask you as well, is what's your favorite part of Fort Whyte? What is that one part about Fort Whyte or our mission or whatever it is that we carry on that you most enjoy?
Do you mean besides the thousands of smiles and aha moments that I've seen on the faces of kids over the years?
Yeah, that's an easy answer.
Yeah. Okay. there's some really, really cool programs that I've got to be part of. I can think of a few that are coming back in the fall, where we're trying to make nature more accessible to folks who might not otherwise have outdoor experiences. I'm thinking specifically of the Strong Roots program, some work I'm doing with folks who are low to no vision. That's incredibly satisfying. I realize how lucky I am to have grown up with that natural connection, and making that possible for others just gives me all sorts of warm, good feels. But truly, my favorite individual parts of Fort Whyte, it's not a part, it's sort of, um, there's a song from about 15 years ago called The Quiet Things That No One Ever Knows. And those are my favorite parts, the quiet things that no one ever knows. When you see an owl fly across the trail at sunset, when walking back to your car, there's a woodchuck flopped out in the shadow of a tree because it's 40 above, and the woodchuck's just enjoying the summer day as much as you're going to. The fact that I get to go to work and I do. I work with a really awesome team, and I'm not just saying that because there's a few people on staff on the call, like Connor there. But I work with awesome people, but I also get to work with 35 amazing bison. That I know the previous presentation was about bison. Um, I have 35 bison colleagues along with my human colleagues. These are things that keep me coming back day after day.
Here's an interesting question, and it'll test your knowledge a bit. Do you know who the original 13 people with the vision for FortWhyte Alive were, or at least some of that group, if you can name them? It seems like we're going to the Saturday Night Trivia right now.
Yeah, yeah. I can picture, I can put the picture in my mind. It's some very dapper looking gentlemen with rods and going fishing. I know who some of the original founders of Fort Whyte as an organization are, but I don't know the names of anybody who are part of that Lucky 13 club. I This is one of those ones where if I was asking the question to a class, I don't know, but I can find out. I do know where to find those answers, and that would be in some of Fort Whyte's historical material and in different archives. Um, but no, I don't know. If anybody on the call is one or is related or knows of one, that would be, please pop that in the chat and help me learn. But no, I don't know off the top of my head. I can picture them. Definitely can picture them.
The good thing is, Barrett, I do have this person's contact. So, I mean, you can do a bit of hunting and
For sure.
find that answer. Absolutely. We're waiting on a few more questions. If you have any, kind of a last call for questions. I do have one that carried over from the previous presentation that I asked the other presenter, and you're kind of one of our staff members that gets out with the bison the most. What's your favorite thing about particular our herd of bison at Fort Whyte?
Okay. Particularly our herd at Fort Whyte is bison beach time. Bison beach time is fun. Uh, I realize that it's probably just instinct and coincidence. Every mammal, every sentient being on a really hot day that can seek out water and then sunshine and wind to dry off will probably do that. Now, that said, going to the water, frolicking around in the water, and then lying in the sun to dry off and just sort of enjoy a summer afternoon, that looks very, very, very much like the human impulse to go to the beach. Our bison do it throughout the day, but predictably on a hot day, right around 2 p.m., right around the time that I'm thinking, man, this would be a good beach day. If you're out there with the bison, they are going for bison beach time. Um, so I have to say that I'm sure other bison herds do that. I'm sure that other animals do that. I know that I am an animal that does that when I can. Um, but the fact that it's somewhat predictable and it's one of the times that I think I relate best to that non-human but still awesome coworker. Bison beach time is one of my favorite bison things.
Absolutely, I can't agree enough. Well, it looks like we're low on questions, so I'll wrap it up there, Barrett. I can't thank you enough for joining us. Everyone else, I can't thank you enough also for joining us on the Earth Day today to celebrate our Earth from home safely. And be sure to check out our calendar because we got a lot of exciting presentations coming up, stretching right through till Sunday evening. So be sure especially tomorrow, to get onto our website and check out our calendar of virtual events coming up. Also, I want to kind of challenge our audience tonight to get out and explore your neighborhood nature nook, as we say at Fort Whyte, because connection equals responsibility. And the more you feel responsible for something, the more you want to protect it. So let's make sure we get out and enjoy nature throughout the rest of this week and the weekend. I wish everyone a safe, happy, and healthy springtime and into the summer. And hopefully we see you at some virtual experiences coming up from Fort Whyte. So thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you, Connor. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.